Hello everyone, we are with Ms. Inger Esching, Chief Executive of the Save the Children International today for another episode of WHF Talks Live, and it's such an honor for me to conduct this with such a leader. We will be touching upon the mission of the Save the Children in times of COVID-19 and how this mission ties into UN SDGs and of course latest humanitarian affairs. Welcome Inger, it's such a pleasure to welcome you here today.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I really look forward to this conversation.
Likewise here. So let's start with the first question to you then. Save the Children's global COVID-19 response has three primary focuses: serve, learn, and protect. Can you outline some of the specific work that the Save the Children is doing in these areas, and what are the successes and challenges faced?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will absolutely outline some of the specific work we are doing, but first I want to say something about how COVID-19 is impacting children. And as we all know around the world, that there are too many children that starts lives at a disadvantage simply because who they are and where they're born. And in Save the Children, we do have a bold ambition. We believe in a world in which all children survive, have the chance to learn, and are protected from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And we also know that Corona is the biggest global health, social, and economic crisis in our lifetime, and that the pandemic has already had a deep impact on children, their families, and their communities around the world. And all over the world, COVID-19 is tearing children's lives apart. We have launched a 100 million appeal, the largest in the history of Save the Children, and we are rapidly adapting our existing work to respond to the outbreaks in countries. Our Protected Generation agenda for action calls on the global community to unite and protect the generation of children from the impacts of COVID-19. And earlier this month, I'm very proud to say that we launched a global Protected Generation report, where we asked children and their families around the world. We got the voices from more than 25,000 children from many, many different countries to hear what do they feel and how do they experience COVID-19, because they are the people that really knows what impacts it has on their lives. And so we do have a lot of data on what children experience themselves. And one of the findings from the report is that far from being the great leveler, COVID-19 has widened the existing inequalities and the poor has become poorer. In our response to COVID-19, we have supported nearly 10 million children and families across 88 countries. But to give some examples of the work, because that was what you were asking for, if I start with Survive, which is one of our priorities, I think it's important to stress that the coronavirus has had wider implications for children beyond the immediate threat to their health. We see that with the virus threatening health systems across the world, that we see a lot of children missing out on life-saving health and nutrition services. And when we asked in this survey that I just talked about how COVID impacts household, nearly 90% of the household said that they are struggling to access health and medicine. 2/3 have issues accessing food. So what we are doing is that we are doing a lot of things, of course, to try to support children around the world. But one example is that we are distributing hygiene materials. And in Cameroon, we are providing refugees with clean water and hygiene kits. We are also making sure in all countries where we work that we are giving children and their families the right information on how they can stay healthy and trying to mitigate the spread of the virus. Another example is in Nigeria, where we are working with the Lagos state government to make sure that children don't miss out from regular immunization. Because as I said, access to routine and essential health service is a real challenge around the world. If I'm going to take a couple of examples around the area of education, I think we all know by now that this is the biggest crisis in the educational system that we've ever seen in the world. And globally, over 1 million children and students have had their education disrupted by the virus. And we also know that as many as 10 million children might never return. We launched a campaign, Save Our Education campaign, where we are calling on governments to make sure that learning is alive, that children can return to school, and that they invest in building better educational systems. And so far, we have helped over 2 million children access distance learning. We have also supported 50 countries to adapt their curriculum to COVID-19. And one example from one country where we work is in Ethiopia, where we have opened a camel library, which brings books to children in remote communities, children that will not get access to any books or any education. So through this camel library, we have supported 22,000 children across 33 villages. The third area that you asked around was protection. And as in any crisis, children are at increasing risk of violence throughout the pandemic, and particularly girls and children in fragile settings. And in the survey that we did, almost 1/3 of the households said that violence had occurred during lockdown. And we know that children are even more vulnerable to violence and abuse than they were before the pandemic. In Norway, we have made sure that we are working to support children that need help, so there's somewhere they can turn themselves, and trying to make sure that the welfare system is in place to support children. In Uganda, we are training caseworkers and child protection committees, having workshops on positive parenting and supporting the most vulnerable children individually. And we have provided nearly 300,000 children and adults with mental health and psychological support. So that's some of the things that we've been doing in our response to COVID this far.
Yeah, fantastic work, really. You mentioned about the impact on education, which is a clear thing, and with millions of children around the world having been out of the school for most of 2020, and as you have mentioned, many of them might not even come back. And last week it was warned that education faces $150 billion worth of cuts in low and middle income countries. In short, what are some of the potential consequences of these kinds of cuts? Is an effective response to this kind of danger possible?
Of course, I have to believe it's possible, because I guess that's why we are all here and doing the work that we're doing. But I also think that it is critical to really stress how serious the situation is. And for the first time in history, an entire generation of children has had their education disrupted, no matter where they live in the world. This is affecting all children. And of course, for any child suddenly being cut off of school, with everything that means, as in their education, their learning, their social relationships, normality, it's tough. But for the more children living in more vulnerable situations, it can really be devastating. And as you said, and I said myself before, we know that children who live in poorer countries, in refugee camps or war zones, might never return to school. And that is especially true for girls. So girls is a group that we really need to have a close eye on and really focus on in our response. When we ask children themselves how education have been impacted this far because of COVID-19, 80% of the children said that they learned little or nothing during the pandemic. And we also heard a lot of girls saying that because of the pandemic and being out of school, they were also asked to take on more responsibility at home, taking care of their household, taking care of their siblings, expressing a real concerns for their future and their ability to return to school. And not being in school, also having much more cases of violence in the homes. We know that without access to education, we see a real risk of children being pushed into long-term poverty, and that will affect themselves and the future generations. But as of now, we see a lot of children that might be pushed out to work to just support their families and make sure that their families survive. They have to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, so that is the real risk. We see a risk of children going hungry. For some children, school meals is the only nutritious meal that they get in a day. And for girls, to return to girls as a group of special attention, we also know that being out of school, there will be a risk of increased domestic violence, unwanted pregnancies, and child marriages, which of course will mean that these girls are robbed of their future and they will be trapped in a cycle of poverty and potential violence. This is especially critical in refugee settings, and when we talk about children in Syria or the Rohingya children who have fled the country's civil war, they're already living in camps, many of them, where they have no access to basic health care, and where going to school was already challenging, and these children might never return to school. So we are seeing a real threat to a generation of children, but especially to, the more vulnerable children. And as I said, school is not just about learning. Of course, without an education, it's very difficult to get a future and get access to a more developed labor market. But it's also about social connections. It's around normality, and for some children, it's where they have their only healthy meal in a day. So this is the biggest global educational emergency we've ever seen. In the campaign that we have launched, we are calling for governments to act, and we think that we need a global educational emergency plan that ensures that all children can continue to learn while schools are closed. So we need to invest much more in distance learning. We think it's critical that every child is supported to return to school when that is possible and when it's safe to do so. And rather than cutting investments in education, governments and donors should invest more in education now so that we can build better educational systems for the future.
Yeah, thanks for the clarifications, and definitely through this interview as well, we are calling for all the donors to act on education. Yes, there are so many areas that we all need to act, but education is one of the key areas for our future, for our youth. You mentioned, and we all know that Save the Children is working in multiple countries across the world, and you mentioned, you gave some examples of the governments you're working with, but can you give us further examples how Save the Children is working with governments to ensure children are protected during this time?
Absolutely. I think that first I want to say that quite a lot of the work that we are doing normally is working in partnership with governments, working with health ministries, educational ministries, etc. in the countries where we work. So working with government, trying to advocate for the rights of the child, but also to help them in implementing different programs is something that we normally do. And of course, we are intensifying this in our COVID response. And what we are trying to do is to bring to their attention how the crisis is impacting children and what responding actors the governments can and should do about it. So it's about advocating towards government. I think what we are in a unique position to do is to bring research and evidence to influence them and do that together with children, because of course children's own voices are critical in the response to COVID, and the governments in the respective countries need to listen to their own children and youth. But we also see many governments are reaching out to us for advice, and we see in Spain, for example, we've been invited by the Spanish government to the National Task Force to shape the response to COVID. In Afghanistan, the Afghani government has reached out to us to work with them after we issued a public warning that over 7 million children are at risk of hunger. And so there's a lot of examples of how governments work with us and how we try to influence them in their national response to COVID.
That's fantastic. For many children around the world, particularly in conflict-stricken areas, displacement is far from uncommon. A recent case of this being a concern is in Lebanon, where several weeks after the explosion in Beirut, around 100,000 children have seen their home destroyed and 300,000 have been left homeless or displaced as a consequence of the blast. Thinking about this recent example in particular, what kind of work does the Save the Children do for children affected by displacement?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Of course, responding in a humanitarian situation is one of the core things that we do as an organization. So in Beirut, we are doing what we normally do, and our natural response or our normal response to an emergency is to make sure that we provide safe spaces for children to feel safe, play and learn. We are also focusing on making sure that children that has been separated from their families can reunite if possible. We are providing emergency relief and healthcare, psychological support, temporary schools, and often cash grants to help families rebuild their lives. In Beirut right now, we are focusing on providing weatherproofing kits for families whose windows and doors have been destroyed in the explosion. We are also providing psychological first aid for children and the families. There's a lot of need for urgent food and hygiene supplies, as many shops have been destroyed. We are working with cash transfers because there's a lot of families struggling to cope, and also supporting families to teach their children at home. So that's some of the things that we are doing. We're also, of course, working in other emergencies, and one of them is the Rohingya crisis, where we have been supporting the Rohingya people since they were driven out of their homes 3 years ago. And in that emergency, we have built health facilities. We are setting up temporary learning centers. We are focusing very much on supporting girls. So we have not just, we normally provide what we call child-friendly spaces, but in the Rohingya camps, we have particularly focused on girl-friendly spaces so that girls have a safe space to meet. And as a result of COVID-19, we have also opened recently an isolation treatment center in the Rohingya camp.
Right. To summarize, Save the Children's mission is to ensure that all children have the basic needs to reach their full potential and to protect the most vulnerable children through programming, emergency responses, and advocacy. With 2020 being the start of the decade for action despite COVID-19, how does Save the Children's mission tie into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals?
I would say that there's an absolute fit between our mission and the SDGs. And as one of the things that we are doing is that we are campaigning in all the countries where we work and where we are present. We are campaigning for governments to take action to accelerate progress towards the SDGs. And of course, ultimately, the realization of all children's rights are set out in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we do all that work with a particular focus on children left behind. And one of the real promises in the SDGs is to leave no one behind. And to make this promise a reality, we all need to focus on the most marginalized, deprived, and most at risk of being left behind. And that is the whole focus of what we do in Save the Children, making sure that we are leaving no one behind. And I would say that the pledge for leaving no one behind is particularly important for children, because we know that they are held back because of a lot of factors that are completely out of their control. They are impacted by where they live, what family they were born into, and their gender, etc. So focusing on the children left behind is core in our mission. And throughout our programs, our emergency responses, and also our advocacy, we always put emphasis on the most vulnerable children first. And we are committed to work with the international community to ensure that children survive, learn, and are protected from violence by 2030.
COVID-19 has caused tremendous setbacks for the SDGs that look set to continue. Responsibility is often placed on the planet's youth to be the future change makers of the world. And so how can we equip them with the necessary knowledge to be the ones to drive the SDGs forward?
I think it's great that there's so much recognition for the voices and the power of youth and children. So I think that's a very positive development. But I also think it's critical to not put the responsibility on youth, because it is the responsibility of adults, of the governments and all the different actors. But having said that, I truly believe, and we truly believe, that the voices of children are critical in all discussions around the SDGs, and that their voices, their demands should be at the heart of the decision programs and policies that are put in place to achieve the SDGs. Children and children alone know what their challenges are and what they need, so their voices must be heard. What we do in Save the Children is that we are supporting thousands of children each year to speak out, to campaign and influence change in their own communities, with the governments and also with the UN when we have the opportunity. But we can't, as I said, rely on young people alone. And here I actually want to quote one of the youth campaigners that we are working with. Her name is Jorda. And she said, in 2015, world leaders promised to leave no one behind. This means that everyone should benefit from the Sustainable Development Goals, especially those who are missing out at the moment. We can help lead that change, but we also need our leaders to keep the promise they made to people. Together, we need to make the poverty and discrimination that children face visible, understand it, and address it. So just to underscore what Jorda said, this is something where youth can have and will have an important voice, but the leaders around the world need to work with them. Right now, we in Save the Children are campaigning with children from around the world as part of our Save Our Education campaigns. So we are providing them with a platform that we call Tell My Leaders, so they can make demands directly to the decision makers about their education, which is SDG 4, and we are doing that in many different areas. But just to give you one example of how we make sure that youth and children and their voices are heard.
Fantastic initiative. Thank you, Inger, for your time today. It has been a real pleasure to discuss the most pressing issues with you. My last question to you is, what is your message to the audience today and to the international community?
Yeah, thank you for that. Of course, there's a lot of things that could be said, but I want to say that we all know that millions of children are dying from preventable causes. They face poverty, violence, disease, and hunger. They are caught up in war zones and disasters that they did nothing to create. And they are denied an education and their human rights. All children deserve better. COVID-19 could unravel 30 years of progress in protecting children's survivals and rights. We must act now before it's too late. An entire generation's future depends on it. I want to close by sharing 2 quotes from children that have reminded me of why our work is so important today. And of course, I would like children to have the final word. So these are the most critical messages to the international community and anyone listening to this discussion. A 12-year-old girl from Syria shared, "We are not living our childhood. This is something no child should ever have to experience, not being able to live their childhood." Another quote is from another 12-year-old girl, but this time from Kosovo, who told us, "Work with children more. We are the future, and how you treat us now is how the future will look too." Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.